Hello. I'm Bob Rivkin, Deputy Mayor of Chicago, and with me today is Leslie Darling, the Executive Director of the Chicago Infrastructure Trust, and other colleagues who you'll meet shortly. More than a century ago, Daniel Burnham encouraged Chicago to make no little plans, and today, Chicagoans continue to make big and bold plans with an eye toward the future. Strengthening connections between the economic engines of downtown Chicago and O'Hare Airport will build on Chicago's legacy of innovation and pay dividends for generations to come. Express service to and from O'Hare will give Chicagoans and visitors to our great city more options, faster travel times, and build on Chicago's competitive advantage as a global hub of tourism, transportation, and trade. Last month, as you know, we issued a request for qualifications to determine private sector interest in financing, constructing, and operating this service. And today marks the next step to clarify procurement provisions and to allow interested parties to network with one another. And as we see today, there are a lot of interested parties. The RFQ builds on analysis from a working group formed last year with WSP and city officials to determine the feasibility of this project. The working group studied demand for ridership, potential terminal locations, routes, and alignments. We will create a fast and convenient travel option for travelers to go directly from O'Hare to downtown Chicago in 20 minutes or less, which is half off current travel times. Now, as I said, I want to introduce Leslie Darling, who's leading the Chicago Infrastructure Trust's process to find the team who will execute on this bold plan. Thank you for being here.
It's great to see such a full room here at the Chicago Cultural Center today. Thank you, Bob, for making the introduction. I also want to acknowledge the Chicago Department of Aviation Commissioner Ginger Evans, right here in the front row, who's also joining us today. Thank you for being here, Ginger. And we also have many representatives from our city partners, from Department of Planning and Development, from Chicago Department of Transportation, from CTA, and many others who served both on the working group and are here as part of the team that is putting this together. So I want to thank them all for being here today. I want to go through quickly a little bit about what we're going to be sharing with you today. So our agenda is, as you see here, we'll talk about a project overview. We'll talk about procurement and contract structure, RFQ parameters. We'll do a brief question and answer session. As you came in, most of you, I hope, were given an index card. We are only going to be accepting questions in writing. We also ask that for any requests for clarifications or detailed questions that you submit those through the processes through the RFQ. But we will be accepting written questions today that we will try to get to as many as we possibly can today, but we will also address many of them in writing in the days to come. And also, as many of you are here for, the networking session to give you all an opportunity to meet each other and think about your teams as we move forward for this great project. So now I have to have my lawyer hat on for a second. The lawyers are, my colleague lawyers are making me say this. So nothing that I say or anything that's said today at this presentation, whoops, sorry, there we go, is going to supersede what's written in the RFQ document. And any changes resulting from today's conference will be officially incorporated into the procurement documents as a written addendum. or clarification and posted on the Chicago Infrastructure Trust website at chicagoinfrastructure.org. And a list of today's conference attendees with contact information, so make sure you didn't give out your personal cell phone number, and a copy of today's PowerPoint presentation will also be on our website. So just a little bit about the Chicago Infrastructure Trust for those of you who are not familiar with us. We were created in 2012 as a nonprofit organization by Mayor Rahm Emanuel and the City Council of the City of Chicago in order to leverage alternative financing and delivery structures to expand the capacity of the city and other government agencies to deliver transformative infrastructure projects. So that means we deliver on that mission and provide value to the city in primarily 3 ways. We provide city and sister agencies financial and feasibility analysis on potential projects. We serve as a specialized resource on project delivery. We provide procurement services on the city's behalf and in coordination with them, as we're doing here on this project. And we provide project management services. So I'm going to discuss the project goals and objectives today, the project opportunity, and look forward a little bit on potential ridership, and a bit about what we expect from developers on this project. So it's appropriate today that we're in the Chicago Cultural Center, the home of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, which I hope you all have a chance to visit today while you're here. The theme of that biennial is to make new history, and that's what we're here to do today, so I really appreciate you joining me. This is an opportunity for us to work with the private sector to deliver visionary, game-changing infrastructure that will change the way Chicagoans and visitors move to and from our great city. The project has the potential to have far-reaching implications, some of which we can't even imagine today, and that will impact the connection of the city's 2 economic centers, as Bob said, O'Hare and the Chicago Loop. So the goals are to provide express service, to make it convenient for passengers, to leverage the private sector, and to provide efficient project delivery. So that first goal is providing express service between O'Hare and downtown Chicago. As Bob said, we want a travel time of 20 minutes or less. We want direct O'Hare terminal access. We want to provide downtown Chicago, a downtown Chicago terminal with easy access to connect with other transportation systems and provide a reliable service via a separate corridor, tracks, or operating priority than what we have now. For convenience to users, we want fast and reliable service. We want a service frequency of every 15 minutes for the majority of the day and up to 20 hours of service per day, and a reasonable, and to offer that service at a premium fares that are less than the cost of current taxi or rideshare services available today. And obviously, we want a modern and convenient vehicle and passenger amenities. For leveraging the private sector resources and expertise, we have an opportunity here to incentivize private sector innovation. Technology has improved so much since the last time the city looked at this project, and we think that this is a moment and an opportunity to move this project forward in a very meaningful way. As you've read in the RFQ and seen in the media, there will be no utilization of public funding for project design, construction, or implementation of this project, and we're looking for a concessionaire to design, build, finance, operate, and maintain the entire system. And we want an efficient project delivery, and that means we want to avoid and minimize conflicts with existing transportation systems and minimize and mitigate any environmental impacts as well. As you know, O'Hare is already one of the busiest airports in the United States, and the Chicago Department of Aviation and Commissioner Evans and Mayor Emanuel are working very hard to expand the capacity of O'Hare for decades to come. But for any of you who came from O'Hare via car, you know that the Kennedy Expressway is at capacity. So we know that there is great demand and an excellent opportunity for another option between the airport and downtown. And demand will only grow over the next few decades. We know that in 2016, there were almost 20,000 riders, two-way riders between downtown and O'Hare, And we expect by 2045 that will grow to over 35,000 passengers a day. At a very high level, this is what we're looking for high-speed transportation from O'Hare to downtown. We want it constructed on, above, or below surface corridors that exist today. We want a station at O'Hare and one in the central business district, and there will be at least one maintenance facility. And that, as I already said, it will be a privately operated system. So the design, building, operating, and maintaining and financing will be for the concessionaire and not the city. We really want to incentivize innovation and forward-thinking ideas and maximize efficiencies not only for the construction but for the entire life cycle of the asset. For potential alignments, the city is open to the proposal of any feasible alignment that would prove most efficient and effective for the delivery and financing of the project. Several system alignments have been studied by the city and its consultants: the CN-CSX corridor, the CTA Blue Line, and the Metro NCS corridor. And further details are available in Exhibit B of the RFQ. As I said, we are open to other alternatives. These are just ones that have already been studied by the consultants. The O'Hare station should be located near Terminals 1 and 3, potentially near the Blue Line stop or in the surface parking lot. And the downtown station, we are open to a number of different options. Some that have been identified include Block 37, where the original announcement was for this project, the Chicago Union Station, the CTA Blue Line Clinton Station. And we know that many of the developers that are in this room are not from the city of Chicago, so we welcome you to our city. But I want to be clear that the CIT and the city of Chicago are 100% committed to diversity and inclusion on this and all other projects. It is of the utmost priority that Chicago residents benefit from the projects taking place throughout Chicago's diverse communities, even if those residents never take the O'Hare Express system. We want you to prioritize the utilization of a Chicago workforce and engage the MBE, WBE community. There are resources there like assist agencies, and MBE, WBE lists that are available on the city's Department of Procurement Services website that will help you determine and learn more about the resources that are available to help meet vendors that will meet this need. And then immediately following, we'll also have the networking session, so we'll look forward to allowing many of you to meet then. And now I want to turn the presentation over to Tom Badescu, who is the Managing Director of the Chicago Infrastructure Trust, and who will provide more information about the contract structure. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Leslie. We are really excited about this great turnout today. Obviously, there's a lot of interest, and we recognize that a lot of you have worked around the city of Chicago on many city projects, but perhaps not on P3 projects, while others of you have developed some of the world's largest P3 projects, but perhaps have not worked on many city of Chicago projects. So we really hope that today's session and the sections that I'm going to introduce now can sort of help bridge that gap and help you understand the provisions that are written in the RFQ with relation to the typical city approaches and what's being incorporated to sort of help put through the typical P3 processes. So, you know, I obviously share the enthusiasm of Deputy Mayor Rivkin and Leslie for the project and the opportunity it presents. However, I'm really here to talk about the granular detail, the administrative process of the procurement, and really bore you guys a little for the next 20 minutes. But I'm going to really talk about what are we asking for, how are we asking you to provide it to us, what are we going to do with it, and what's the next steps after that. All right. So project delivery method, and when we talk about project delivery method, it's really what are we procuring? And we are looking to find a single entity, which we'll be referring to as the concessionaire, in this presentation, to design, build, finance, operate, and maintain the O'Hare Express system. And so we'll ultimately look to have a contract with a single counterparty responsible for delivering that comprehensive project scope. It will be through a revenue-based concession. So 100% financed by the concessionaire, and in consideration for the services provided under the contract, the concessionaire would be granted the rights for project-specific revenues. All right, so we said, what are we looking for? And now we're talking a little bit, well, how are we looking to identify and find this concessionaire? And we're looking at a two-part procurement process, and that means an RFQ, RFP process. As you're all aware, the RFQ was issued last month on November 29th. SOQs are due towards the end of January 24th. Once those are submitted, the city and the CIT will work to evaluate these statements of qualifications to identify a short list of the most qualified respondents. The goal is to shortlist no more than 3 respondent teams. Only those shortlisted respondent teams that have been deemed qualified will be eligible to respond with proposals to the request for proposals that is issued after that. And then the other part we wanted to get across in this slide is that the procurement doesn't end with the selection of the best value proposal. Once the proposals are turned in and the city and the CIT review them and select a best value proposer, they will all work together to finalize the form of contract that will be expected to executed. It will not be executed until there is city council approval of the transaction, and only once the city is granted authority to execute it and then executes that contract will the procurement be complete. So a little bit about the procurement schedule. This is right out of the RFQ, so if you've read that document, this should look familiar. RFQ was issued on the 29th of November. We're all here today at the pre-bid networking conference, December 20th. The next big deadline is the request for clarifications deadline. As Leslie mentioned, we will be taking some written questions today. Those that we aren't able to answer due to time or other constraints today, we will take back to the office and we will treat them as a request for clarification. But when it comes to material clarifications regarding the RFQ, I would really encourage you to submit them via the protocol outlined in Section 8.3 of the RFQ. We will then take all those requests for clarifications, work with our city partners and the affected departments and agencies to provide those clarifications when we can on the RFQ and the project. That will be posted publicly on the city's website. If any addendum is necessary to the RFQ, that would also be posted publicly on our Infrastructure Trust website. Anyone who's registered as a document holder will be alerted anytime a clarification document or an addenda is posted on the CIT website. After that, the statements of qualifications will be due January 24th. Our intention is to have a shortlist identified by the end of February of 2018. We would like to issue an RFP draft to the shortlisted team by May of 2018, invite those shortlisted respondents for presentation in August, and have bids due in November. The caveat with every one of these pre-submittal conferences is, if you've attended them and seen us present the schedule, is, this is our goal. We're committed to trying to achieve it, but it's always subject to change based of the realities of the procurement. All right. So once we've gone through the procurement and found our best value proposer and are ready to execute the contract, what are we expecting in that contract structure? There's not too much we can talk about today. In the RFQ stage, we're still painting with a pretty broad brush. I think we're going to dive into a lot more detail in the RFP, but we can tell you, again, a single comprehensive contract for the design, build, finance, operations, and maintenance of the full project. You can expect that the contract will include many of the city's typical provisions for public works and other regular requirements. So that's the city's multi-project labor agreements, prevailing wage rates, MBE, WBE requirements, and then depending on the final alignment and terminals, and hopefully we'll have more information on this by the time we issue the RFP, potentially some of the airport concession disadvantaged business enterprise, ACDBE participation goals. A draft agreement will be part of the RFP that's provided to the shortlisted respondents, and we'll expect to be refining that draft agreement through the iterative RFP process. A little more detail on the contractual structure can be found in section 4.2 of the RFQ. So the same caveat applies to the financing structure. This is, again, something where we're going to have more detail as we are able to get into the RFP and to the provisions of the contract. But at the moment, we can sort of provide some broad brushstrokes. Concessionaire will be responsible for financing the entire project. The city will not be providing any funding towards the contract for services rendered, nor will they be providing any credit support. The concessionaire will be granted a right to the project-specific revenue in considerations of the services rendered under the contract. But the city will cooperate with respondents in assisting to access federal credit and tax-exempt bond programs to the extent desired. All right, so RFQ parameters, and here I'm really going to talk a little more specifically what we're expecting you to submit as part of your statements of qualifications in response to our RFQ. So this is one slide, but it's got a lot in there, and I want to get a little bit in the weeds here. So we've asked the statements of qualifications to be subdivided into two parts, Part A and Part B. You keep hearing me say DBFOM, or Design, Build, Finance, Operate, and Maintain. Part A is really focused on the design, build, operations, and maintenance. Part B is really focused on the financing. So Part A starts with, so before I get into Part A, all of the information on the submittal requirements are in Exhibit A. And I would really encourage all of you, if you're considering submitting a statement of qualifications in response to this RFQ, to read Exhibit A in great detail, because it's critical that your statement of qualification is responsive to the submittal requirements of this RFQ, or it will not be considered for scoring. What we are seeking at a high level through your statement of qualification is information that we think provides us an ability to determine your capacity, your qualification, and your experience to ultimately deliver the comprehensive DBFOM scope. And so Part A, general materials, this is really three different things. A couple are, the first one's pretty administrative. We've got a checklist that tells you, here's everything we think we've asked you for in this RFQ. Make sure you check through and tell us you've provided everything we've asked for. Number two is the SOQ submittal letter. We've provided a form of the letter in Form B. We are asking you to reproduce that form filled out with the appropriate corporate entities and signed by the appropriate signatory under your letterhead as part of your submission. And then we're looking for an executive summary that at a high level, concise, and clearly states why you believe you present a qualified respondent team to deliver us this project. So number two, prime team members and guarantors information. These are really basic forms that are the detailed information on who the corporate entities that make up this team is. Name, address, incorporation, things of those nature. Part three, team composition and structure. So we know who the corporate entities that make up your team. Now tell me more about how your team is set up. What's the management structure? What's the organizational chart look like? Who are the key personnel? What are their experiences? We want to see their resumes and their project experience. So the next one is relevant development experience. So we know who your team is. We know the corporate entities. We know the organizational structure. We know the key personnel. Now tell me about what are your previous design, construction, operation, and maintenance experiences that can give me comfort to say you can deliver what we are asking for in this project. So this is all about your past past experience delivering comparable projects. And we give some guidance in the RFQ what we deem more or less comparable. And so these first four sections are all about who you are, what you've done, who you're bringing to the table. Section 5, approach to project development. This is where we're asking you to be a little more specific about our project and giving us a thoughtful, forward-looking narrative to say, okay, we read your RFQ, we understand what you're asking for, we came to the pre-submittal conference and understood the parameters of the project. Here's what we think is a reasonable way to approach this project. Here's what we think are the constraints and the risks, and what are some potential risk mitigants. And the other thing that we're really encouraging people to do here is to say, here are some potential benefits and constraints to the different alignments, and here are the alignments that we really think is our preference to, that works the best in delivering this project efficiently and effectively. And the same thing goes for the downtown terminal. Next, MBE, WBE, ACDBE, and Workforce Development Participation Plan and Experience. That's a bit of a mouthful. Leslie talked about the critical importance of the participation of a diverse workforce and engaging with the subcontractor, with the minority and women-owned subcontractor community of Chicago. I'm not going to get into that. I think it's a critical of importance. What I want to do is two things. I want us to talk about what we're not expecting in the submittal and what we are. So if you've done a lot of City of Chicago work and you see participation plan, you might be thinking Schedule C's, Schedule D's. That's not in the RFQ yet. So we've provided that as an Exhibit F to say, here's what the MBE, WBE compliance plan that ultimately is going to be part of the contract. This is what it looks like. So if you haven't done business with the City of Chicago, you should be aware of it. We're not looking for the Schedule C's and D's at this point. What we're looking is a thoughtful narrative that says, I understand the importance of this aspect of the project. I have experience meeting or exceeding meaningful participation goals on past projects, and I have a thoughtful plan to make sure that if we are ultimately shortlisted and selected to respond to this RFP, we will be able to come with a team that meaningfully achieves and hopefully exceeds whatever the participation goals ultimately are. Safety record, administrative legal information, those are pretty self-explanatory in the RFQ. I'm not going to get into that. Part B, now this is really a focus on the financial submittals. So the equity funding letters, this is really to tell us who are the entities that are ultimately funding the concessionaire, where is the equity funding coming from, what approval processes will need to be achieved in order to secure that equity funding if you're ultimately shortlisted and selected to execute on this project. We want to make sure that we are selecting and shortlisting teams that truly have the capacity at the end of the day to secure that equity funding and come to the table, execute the contract, and put this project in place. Financial officer certificate, this is really, we're going to look for this, I believe, for all the prime team members. Really an attestation from a financial officer or equivalent regarding the correctness of the financial information, any material changes since the audited financials we're asking you to submit, off-balance sheet liabilities, things like that. Financial statements, pretty self-explanatory. We're here looking to gauge, do you have the capacity to bring forth the financial resources needed to deliver a project of this size? Financial letters of support, what we're looking for here is letters from credible lenders or underwriters saying, we know this team, we know this project, we read the RFQ, we believe that they have the resources and knowledge and expertise to ultimately secure the debt funding necessary for this project, and that we are potentially interested working with them, ultimately determined by the final terms and conditions of the RFP and the P3 contract. Financing experience, this is really an opportunity for the respondent team to demonstrate where else have you secured private financing for the delivery of large infrastructure or transformative transportation projects. Show me that you have the ability to close your to achieve your financial obligation and reach financial goals on a project of this size, magnitude, and scope. And again, so you look at 1 through 5, and this is all about who your team is, where your money's coming from, what your past experience, showing us your capacity and qualification. And then the 5th one, again, much like in Part A, now we know who you are and what you've done. Give us a narrative of what you see working for this project. When you look at the financing requirement, which is significant for this project, how do you see yourself putting together a plan of finance? What are the sources of debt, equity? What are the credit constraints or other constraints, potential risk mitigants, and potential innovative credit enhancements that you think could make this project ultimately feasible? So that's it. That's all we're asking for. So, you know, like I said, what the goal is there is really to provide us a comprehensive package of information that allows us to look at your team, understand who it is that makes up this responded team, what are their collective experiences and capacity to truly deliver on this comprehensive scope. And I think it's really a critical step in the procurement, because this is ultimately a very ambitious project, and we want to make sure that the teams that we select to move on to the next stage really have the qualifications and capacity to deliver on this. So what happens once you submit those statements of qualifications? The first thing is that we're going to make sure that you have submitted everything we asked you to. So that's the responsiveness review. If you submit only part of the RFQ requirements, or say, oh, I just want to design the project, I don't want to be responsible for everything else, you'll be deemed non-responsive, and your statement of qualification may not be scored. All those responses that are then deemed responsive will be shared with the evaluation committee. That'll be CIT and city employees. And you know, we've got 5 general criterias that we're gonna bucket together and look at to determine whether your team is qualified to do this project. And so we have them listed here in descending weight. So your relevant experience, and so that's a little ambiguously phrased, but here we're talking about your experience around design, construction, operation, and maintenance. This is, can you really develop and operate this project? The next is really more about the financing. Do you have the capacity, the qualifications, and the experience to execute on that F part of the DBFOM? Number 3 is really about, do we think that the way you've put your team together organizationally, structurally, the people and the processes that you've described in your statement of qualification is really a feasible approach to developing this project ultimately? Number 4 is your narrative regarding the approach to project development, which we talked about before. And the 5th, and the still critical, is, did you give us a thoughtful and meaningful narrative around how you're going to achieve the MBE and WBE participation, meaningful participation, and have you shown us that you've been able to do so in the past? So that's it for the presentation. I think at this point we're going to take a couple minutes to collect some of the questions, and we'll answer as many as we can.
And also, anybody who is in the overflow room upstairs, we invite you to come down and fill in some of the empty areas in advance of the networking session. So at this point, people will come around and collect any written questions that anyone has. Just hold up your card if you haven't, if you have one, and we'll come around and get it. Thank you, and we'll reconvene in just a moment. We have a couple of questions that have already been submitted online, so we will start to address those. Tom, do you want to go ahead and take those?
Sure. Will the CIT publicly post the short list of respondents? If so, when? We expect to post the shortlisted respondents on the Infrastructure Trust website as soon as the shortlist is identified. So as we talked about earlier in the schedule, the goal is to have it identified by the end of February, and we'd like to achieve that goal. What are the rules for communicating with other interested entities after today? How can we put together respondent teams without breaking any rules? Okay, so I think this is perhaps some confusion around the guidelines for communications between respondents. I don't think anybody is saying that you can't talk to other entities as you're trying to form teams. The guidelines in the RFQ is really all about if you are forming a respondent team and you are formulating a statement of qualification, you just have to be cognizant of the state and federal procurement rules and make sure that you're not doing anything that would be construed as collusion or otherwise. I'm not the lawyer. Maybe Leslie, you have something to add to that. Can MBE, WBE contractors work with multiple teams? The answer here, the restriction on working on being part of multiple respondent teams starts at what we call the prime team level, and that's defined in the RFQ. I'm not going to try to remember the definition verbatim, so I encourage you to look in the RFQ to see that definition, but these are really the major leaders of the respondent teams, and there's certainly no restriction on MBE, WBE, and other subcontractors participating on multiple respondent teams as long as they don't meet the definition of a prime team member. I can build a terminal, don't have experience to build rails. Can I submit just to build the terminals? You know, as we alluded to, the answer is no. We're looking, if you're looking for only a part of the scope, then you should find a team to, partners to team up with. We're looking for submittals that are responsive to the full comprehensive scope of the project. Otherwise, it will be deemed unresponsive. Should the EDS, that's the Economic Disclosure Statement, which I believe is a form of which is attached as Exhibit E, I want to say, of the RFQ, should the EDS be completed prior to the SOQ submittal or future RFP submittal? While we certainly encourage everybody to submit their EDS as soon as practicable, you don't need to submit it prior to the RFQ. You will need to submit the EDS before proposals are due to the RFP in the case that you are shortlisted. One more here. Exhibit F, MBE, WBE plan. These are the Schedule C's and D's and E's and F's. Is it provided for reference purposes, or does it contain requirements which the respondent must address in the statement of qualification? I think I mentioned this earlier. These, at this stage, are really there for reference to let you know what you're going to be expected to submit, ultimately be part of the contract. During the statement of qualification phase, you do not need to submit a full Schedule C, Schedule D compliance plan.
I have about 15 questions here about, can we have more time? What I would recommend is that if you haven't already, you make that request in writing through the RFC process, and the team will meet and make an assessment of that. But thank you for your request. Are there any restrictions on fares? Is another good question. And Tom, do you want to address that? I know that the working group has spent a lot of time on that.
Yeah, I think there's no explicit restriction on fares right now, other than to say that we're expecting the fares to be below the cost of a ride share or a taxi. I think if you do look at Exhibit C of the RFQ, which provides the ridership forecast and some of the analysis around the fares. Ultimately, the reality is that that's not going to be where the revenue maximizing fairs will be. So, there might be provisions relating to that ultimately in the contract, but right now we're really focused on understanding what's feasible, both in terms of the design and construction, but also around the financing. So if you do have thoughts or concerns regarding the level of fares, I would encourage you to state those as part of your preliminary plan of finance and your submittal, and we will take them into consideration. But I think the short answer at the moment, there are no explicit restrictions on fares.
There's a question about will an alignment for the project be identified? This is an RFQ project. We'd like to have your best innovative ideas on the alignment, and so that will be something that will be determined later in the project, but we ask you to use your best ideas and innovation to make a recommendation to the city and to the CIT as to what you think the best alignment would be.
Yeah, and I think I would just sort of add the responses that you guys provide in the statements of qualifications, and this is why I was emphasizing that on the project delivery approach regarding the benefits and constraints of the various alignments in your preferred alignment, are going to be taken under serious consideration and inform the city's decision making in terms of being able to narrow down and meaningfully advance a more narrow scope for the project as we move forward with the process. What are the permissible project income streams? I think in the RFQ we talk about obviously the fare box revenue, advertising, sponsorship, concession on the actual system. I think we're still open to other approaches and ideas. So again, this is where I encourage you to think innovatively and provide us interesting ideas as part of your preliminary plan of finance. And we haven't ruled anything out in terms, as long as it's project-specific revenue. And so if you have other thoughts on how we can provide revenue streams into the project, I encourage you to put them in that narrative.
I think that will be all the questions that we are going to be able to answer at this time. However, we will take all of the questions back, and if we are able to provide answers through the request for clarification process and have that answered in mid-January for you. At this time, we invite you all to either stay in here, the room just outside of here, or in the lobby area where you did the check-in, and have an opportunity to meet each other and take advantage of some of the time today to get to know some of your colleagues here. As I said, we will be posting a list of everyone who attended this event within the next 2 days on our website. I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing from all of you with your responses in January. Thanks.